So we just wrapped up the 13th chapter of the Gita, and we're starting up with chapter 14. I think generally something that happens when you study the Gita, I think there's two problems that occur. The first problem is that the text, it's not just written in Sanskrit, but it makes use of sometimes Sanskrit pundits like to say that our sacred texts aren't just written in Sanskrit, they are Sanskrit. I'm having to move so that I can see you. That's the problem, yeah. So they're not just written in Sanskrit, but they are Sanskrit. And that's not, it sounds a little presumptuous and kind of ostentatious and condescending. But there's some legitimate truth to that. Values are encoded in the language of a group. Their values are encoded. And so when you try to translate something from one language into another, when you try to translate something from one language to another, a literal translation sometimes really doesn't cut it. And I'll give you an example. You can say in Spanish, entre en la espada y el pared, right? Entre en la espada y el pared. You enter in the sword and the wall. So, what does that mean? If you were to render that into English, somebody wrote entre la espada y el pared into English, what would you write? You would write, I'm between a rock and a hard place. Which is not a literal translation. But if you do the literal translation, nobody will know what you're talking about. They'll just be confounded, confused. You guys follow this? So a translator has to understand the idiomatic phrases of a tradition, and he needs to be able to, or she needs to be able to translate them into the corresponding idiomatic phrases of another tradition. Did you follow that? That's why, even though they have super expensive translation software, it fails miserably. Because translation is a sophisticated enough process that although a 3-year-old or 4-year-old can be bilingual, the most expensive software in the world isn't. They just came up with some really fancy, what's it called? The new one that Microsoft just bought? For some huge, gargantuan amount of money. You guys don't know this? You guys aren't up to it? Anyway, I'm feeling foolish. But they bought some, the AI of AIs, and then some linguists from MIT. They subjected to a battery test, and they're like, this is useless. And they just revealed pages and pages of simple flaws that it made, because it wasn't actually able to translate, because translation is quite delicate, because there's so many different meanings of so many different words, and they get put together and then stacked on top of each other through a process called recursion. It's just next to impossible. It's something special about human beings, actually. I'm going to the store with my friend at 9 o'clock to buy some stuff for the party that's going to happen tomorrow at my friend's house with all my friends coming. And so that recursion of one idea being stacked on top of another idea, stacked on top of another idea, stacked on top of another idea, that's very easy to do for humans who have what Noam Chomsky called the language acquisition tool or language acquisition device. But it's impossible for all other species, that kind of recursion, something special about us with our huge encephalized brains. So to translate from one language to another, you have to have a feeling for what's being communicated. It's a very delicate process. And although you learn language by imitating, there's this like amazing thing that happens as you imitate. You actually learn to think, and then you think in the language, and you understand it intimately. And if you can learn the language of another tradition, another culture, and you understand all the idiomatic phrases of both, or at least enough of them, and then you get one and one, you can translate it into the corresponding one of the other. But that's provided that both cultures have the same concepts and they're just differently expressed. Do you follow that? How about concepts like dharma? Dharma, okay, it means duty. All right, it also means religion. Like Buddhism is called Bodha Dharma, Dhamma, Bodha Dhamma. Dhamma is the Pali for Dharma. And so Dharma means religion, it means teaching, it means duty, it means attribute, fundamental attribute. And so what term in English communicates all that? Also, dharma is something that you're supposed to give up. Krishna says, sarva dharman tyajya. You should give up all dharma. So he makes that statement in the Gita. So your understanding of dharma has to be such that you can understand that you should give up all dharma. You follow? And you should also have to be able to appreciate that you should follow dharma, because the Gita also speaks of following dharma. In fact, we're going to read that today. So how do you translate a word like dharma into English if it's being used in a sentence? You have to figure out the right way to communicate what's being said in that instance. But then the word dharma, like for instance the word yoga. The word yoga gets used all over the place in the Gita, and Krishna does fun stuff with Sanskrit, like he says, dukkha samyoga viyogam yoga sangyatam. That yoga, it's known as yoga when you un-yoga yourself from your yoga to suffering. So that works. Or atmanyev atmanatushta, in the self, by the self, satisfaction. You should find satisfaction in the self, by the self, and see the self, by the self, with the self, in the self. The word atma is used over and over again. Atmani, atmana, atmanam. So what do you do with that? You need to see the self, in the self, by the self. What does that mean? And so those things are quite powerful in Sanskrit. When you read a verse and the same word is repeated over and over again, it shows you, there's actually some depth to that. It makes you think. It causes you to be thoughtful. But when you render it into English, it becomes nonsensical. Now, that might be cool if you want to leave it super cryptic, but it's not merely cryptic in Sanskrit. It actually clearly communicates something. You just have to understand the language, and you can appreciate what's being said. You need to see the soul with the intelligence. You follow? And so two different meanings of the word Atma. Atma also means oneself. It's a reflexive pronoun. You define happiness in yourself. So anyway, one problem with software that attempts to translate things from one language to another is that the software is simply not sophisticated enough to be able to do the processing that a 3-year-old does. Theoretically, if you could learn every idiomatic phrase of every language and nobody tripped you up, you might be able to render one language into another. Or maybe a computer could never do it, but you could. But then what happens when you have concepts that are actually built into the language and there are no words? Like there's words for fire in every language, or there's words for car in every language. What happens when you start to get concepts that don't actually exist in a given language? It means people don't think in that term. Like, for instance, evil. It's a Western term, evil. We all understand the term evil. Evil is a fundamental, basic malevolence, a basic sadism, a basic malice that's fundamental, that's core, that's eternal, that's a basic feature of reality. You're looking up like there's something going on. I don't know what's going on up there. Did you follow that? You guys with me? That's what the word English evil means in English. There is no Sanskrit word for evil like that. Because in Indic philosophy, the soul is fundamentally good. Because it's fundamentally good, then evil or sin or bad stuff or demons or devils or whatever, they don't exist as some basic feature of reality. They exist as a basic feature of illusion. But just as you can, like a virtual reality isn't actually reality. So if you cleanse someone of all of their dirt or dust, then their evilness no longer exists, because their evilness is 100% their covering and not them. Do you guys follow that? So even the term evil, or even concomitant terms like sin, which is or ideas like hell, an eternal hell, where evil people go and they suffer forever because of their fundamental sin, fundamental irrevocable rebellion against the divine. Those ideas don't even make sense to somebody from people from India. You actually have to explain to them dualism and the idea of a fundamental dualism, where there are things that are truly bad, intrinsically bad. Of course, it leads to a whole host of ideas. How does everything come from a God and something be truly bad? It's really, this is why theodicy is such a hot topic in Christianity, because they really make it hard on themselves with this idea of a radical, absolute dualism. So it works both ways. It works both ways. Language ends up not just representing common ideas between various cultures, but it also ends up encapsulating specific ideas that only exist in one culture and not in another. Do you guys follow this? Okay, so moving forward. In the last chapter, Krishna spoke about Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha, just very simply, means spirit, and Prakriti means matter. And the most obvious experience we have of spirit and matter is ourselves as conscious souls living in a body. Right? All right. So that is it's somewhat vexing, because if you are a pure spirit, how do you get into a body? How do you interface with your body? Does that make sense? Western philosophy has the same problem. They call it Cartesian dualism. Rene Descartes they had a real hard time because they wanted to do science. It was to be like, it was right there at the Renaissance period, the Age of Enlightenment, People wanted to do science, but they had to account for or deal with the mind as a fundamental feature of reality. And so to make it easier for scientists 300 years ago to do, the kind of experimentation they had to do and the kind of philosophizing and analysis they had to do, he just said, okay, let's just call everything has to do with the body is here and everything has to do with the mind is over here, and they're two different things. And he came up with a dualism. And the purpose of that dualism was to stop you from having to try to come up with a grand universal theory. Because it was an insuperable problem of trying to figure out the conscious reality, which is fundamentally subjective, and then reconcile it with the material reality, which is fundamentally objective. Usually we think subjective is like a bad thing. There's a problem with that, is that consciousness, a real thing that you experience at every moment, the most basic feature of reality that allows you to experience all other features of reality, conscious is fundamentally subjective, and it always is subjective, and it can't be objectively understood because you're never conscious of somebody else's consciousness the way you're conscious of your own. You can measure symptoms of consciousness, but you can't measure actual consciousness, the actual voiceover in your head, the actual experience of that there's something it's like to be you in this world and feel the feelings you have and the thoughts. You can analogously try to identify through empathy with somebody else, but it's really based on you having your own experience and extrapolating from that and trying to wrap your head around somebody by looking at their symptoms or thinking about their circumstances and relating them to your own. But there's always that leap, because you can't truly know exactly what it's like to be in somebody else's skin, because consciousness is always experienced in the first person. Even collective consciousness, if we all decide we're going to go get vegan pizza afterwards, collective consciousness is always based on having an individual consciousness as a precursor. There is no meaning to collective consciousness as a fundamental facet of reality. It's always a secondary derivative facet of reality. You guys following me? Descartes realized this because he was smart, and so he just got rid of consciousness. And for the last 200 years, modern science has really not attempted that much to deal with consciousness. The last 20, 30 years, it's come up again. It's a hot topic. You can read in current philosophical journals. You can read in current science books that they're just starting to deal with it, and they haven't solved the problem at all. They're nowhere near solving it. It's just as big a problem as it ever was. And in fact, if anybody's gaining ground in the hard problem of consciousness within the philosophy of mind, it's the theists. We are just beating people over the head with a sledgehammer that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, and it can never be explained by chemical interactions governed by the basic laws of physics. Nor could it be anticipated by the basic laws of physics, which it should be. Anyway, I'm not going to get too much into this, but, and I don't even know, so everybody's got this problem of trying to figure out how the soul got in the body. Everybody's got that problem. Also, if you're an atheist, you have a problem figuring out how the soul got in the body, but you have a problem figuring out how the body became conscious. It's the same problem reversed. Did you guys follow that? This is the big question. This is a big question. So, Krishna explained that the Purusha interfaces with Prakriti by the Gunas. A fully Sanskrit concept. It has no exact corollary in English. You think the Gunas are rough, or you think the Dharma's rough, the Gunas are even worse. The Gunas are even worse because there's not like 6 or 8 terms you can point to and then use different terms for each thing. Atma and Dharma, at least there's 6 or 8 different senses we use the term in. You follow? But the Gunas are the Indic equivalent of evil, in the sense of it's a basic feature of reality which is totally foreign to the Western mind. And so you actually have to stretch yourself out of your culture into another culture to really understand what they're talking about, because they live in a different world than you live. Are you guys with me so far? So this chapter is all about the Gunas. I think the chapter is called Triguna Vibhaga Yoga. the yoga of the divisions of the three gunas. Now, the word guna shows up in the third chapter of the Gita. Prakrita ja gunai, by the gunas, born of Prakriti. So it gets mentioned in the third chapter of the Gita. It's always linked to Prakriti. Prakriti is matter. It's the first evolutive matter. Even the idea of Prakriti is a tough one, because Prakriti is not just your body, but it's also your mind. The soul, in the analogy of the chariot, is the passenger, not the driver. The intelligence is the driver, the minds are the rein, the horses are the senses, the chariot is the body. This is in the Katha Upanishad. But the soul is a passenger. That is not how we understand the soul. We would understand the soul to be the driver, but that would be the intelligence. You follow? And the intelligence is an evolute of Prakriti. Therefore, it's matter. It's sukshma Prakriti. It's subtle matter instead of stula Prakriti or gross matter. So there's a three-part system. There's subtle matter and gross matter and the soul. And most of the stuff that we think of when we think of the mind-body dichotomy, most of the stuff we think of would all fit into the category of matter to an Indic philosopher. And when I say Indic, I mean Jain or Buddhist or Hindu. This stuff is kind of common. There's a real sharing of information. I mean, they hated each other also. But they hated each other in an inclusivistic way, because it was an inclusivistic culture, and so they would borrow freely from each other and then figure out where they could argue. As opposed to the radical dualism of the West, where somebody is completely evil, and they're heathens, and goyim, and infidels, and they're the absolute antichrist. So Prakriti is mentioned starting in the third chapter of the Gita. The gunas are mentioned in the third chapter. And they show up, I think, in every single chapter of the Gita up until this one. And Krishna, uses the word guna and does not bother defining his term. He assumes you know what it means when he begins using it in the third chapter of the Gita, because that's how standard of a term it is. He also uses the term guna in several different ways. He uses it to mean quality or innate quality, and he also uses it to mean fundamental evolute of matter and primary building block of the world. And so he uses the term in a number of different nuanced ways, one of which is highly philosophical, and he assumes that you know the philosophical term, the philosophy behind it, the culture that gave rise to it, etc., etc. Does that make sense? And then, whatever it is, third chapter, the 14th chapter, whatever it is, 11 or 12 chapters, not exactly sure how it works. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, so 11 chapters later. Because it was the beginning of the 14th chapter. 11 chapters later, Krishna is now going to explore the gunas in detail. And the reason is because he's explained Prakriti and Purusha in detail in a way he hadn't prior to this. He assumed you knew what the terms meant. He used them, spirit and matter. But he got into them in considerable detail in the 13th chapter and really started to flesh out the idea of how the soul becomes enraptured in the body. And then the way he explained it was by the gunas, which means strand or rope, a rope which binds something. It's one of the primary meanings. The original meaning of the word guna is strand, like the strand of a rope, that then come together and bind something. So the soul is bound in this world by the gunas. But you're not the gunas. Therefore, you're a victim. But at the same time, you wouldn't be bound by the gunas if you didn't want to, so you still have free will. But your free will more or less consists of whether you turn towards the light or towards the darkness. And if you turn towards the light, then you get sheltered by the divine energy. If you turn towards the darkness, you get sheltered by the illusory energy. And in any case, you're always sheltered by and subservient to something above yourself. You're never just the Lord of all you survey and the chooser of your own destiny, so to speak. Just like when you get those choose your own adventure books. I don't know if they still make those. When I was a kid, they had these choose your own adventure books. And so, it would give you a choice. At the end of a chapter, you get a choice. And it would say turn to page 63 or turn to page 54, and then you would make choices, and you would go, and to then that and you have to like flip back, and it would tell you what happens to you, stuff like that. I'm sure you guys read the book. It's kind of like video games. Video games are sort of like a choose your own adventure book, but you see in 2 dimensions on a screen what's happening, and if you toggle left or toggle right, different things happen. There was another game that came out when I was a kid. I think I was 9 when it came out. It was the first video game where it was actually a movie, like a cartoon, and you would move, and then you would make a move, and then the person would move like for a few seconds. You didn't have absolute control of your character. It was like a choose your own adventure book because the cartoon that you were in charge of, you were like a prince, and it was like you were saving a princess or something like that. I can look up the game. It would have come out in 1981 when I was 9 years old. And it was twice as expensive as all the other games. And I never got good at it because I always die like on the first level very quickly. But you would move, and then it would move for like 10 seconds, and then you get a chance to make another move. Does that make sense? So anyway, in those choose your own adventure books, you don't have absolute control over your character. You can't make every choice at every moment. But you get moments where you can make choices. In that video game I played, you didn't have absolute full control of your character at every moment because the graphics and the coding and what have you didn't support it. But you had some control. That would be kind of like the way we view your free will in this world. You have absolute control if you turn towards the light of the darkness. But once you make that decision, things come into play and you become part of a complex system of karma where you're not just free to do anything you want to do at every moment because your actions have consequences which add up over time and limit your actions over time. Does that make sense? It's actually a more reasonable way of viewing the world. It's a more fair way of viewing the world. It's more consistent with an all-good, all-powerful God. It also allows God some control over things so that you're not a victim of everybody else. And God hasn't abandoned you in this world to fend for yourself, but you can actually surrender to Krishna, and He has some control over the world and can help turn things in your favor. There's a bunch of benefits to it. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the gunas are these strands, and they bind everybody, and they are the primary evolute of Prakriti. So when Prakriti begins to act and is not just a latent, dormant force, but when Prakriti wakes up and begins to create the world and move things in this world, that's done by the gunas. And the gunas are a simple color theory, like red, blue, and yellow, that then allow you to make all the colors of this world. Is my wife there? Who is there? Empower her to come into class for the rest of class if she can't get it together. Like in a primary color scheme, you've got yellow, blue, and red, and with those 3 colors, you can make every color in the rainbow, which is far out. That yellow and blue make green. How cool is that? And that red and blue make purple, right? And you get all the shades. You have like white and black. You get all the tones. It's crazy. It's totally wild. How they mix colors at Home Depot. They just have a few colors. I don't know if they're a 4-part or a 3-part, whatever it is, but and they just mix them. It's just unbelievable. It's crazy. It's totally wild. And they have their bases, which are, like a light or a medium or a dark base, but then the base itself is just a mixture of those 4 colors as well. There's nothing extra going on, and every single color you could ever imagine, in millions of colors, millions and millions of colors, they can just whip them up just by making little adjustments of these primary things. It's totally far. Or how about a computer being all ones and zeros? Or how about everything in this world coming from the fundamental forces of physics, strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity. That's pretty wild. And they can account for almost everything except for consciousness. That's their problem. So there are these wild, simple ways of looking at the world that you encounter sometimes that can explain everything. So one of them is the Gunas. Now you got to be careful, because if you get too into the Gunas, it gets super fatalistic, and you're not responsible for anything, and everything is somebody else's fault, and you're a victim. You're a passenger, and you're not responsible at all for where you're being driven. So you got to watch out for that. There's a pretty significant determinism at work in the Vedic literature, in Indian thought in general. There are some, Charvak Muni, there are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, Indic thinkers have a bit of determinism, have the idea of karma. Your free will is not absolute at every moment, that you can do anything you want to do at any moment. So yeah, you got to be careful not to fall into that well. And remember that you have free will and that it's significant and it's primary. But understanding that, the gunas then become the way that your karma manifests, so that as you are sculpting your life, like if you jump off a building, the option of not breaking your leg is taken off the table. The moment you jump off the building, the option of not breaking your leg is taken off the table. Or if you smoke for 20 years and then stop for 20 years, the option of not getting esophageal cancer may have been taken off the table and you just don't know it yet. Like I have a friend, died of esophageal cancer, smoked for 20 years, quit for 15, and then got esophageal cancer and died in his late 40s. Had no idea it was going to come for him. He just didn't know. Some people smoke for 50 years, never get cancer. But some people, it affected them, and it happened like this. So sometimes you do something, and immediately options are taken off the table, like you jump off a building. Lots of options taken off the table when you jump off a building, depending on how high it is. Just immediately. Your free will is no longer able to determine your destiny. You put something in motion, like that choose your own adventure, like the video game I talked about. And sometimes that takes weeks or months or years to fully manifest. You follow? So the gunas are part of how the material world is governed, and you are carried and you are tossed about like somebody might be tossed about by waves. Now ultimately you chose it, so you can't cry, why is this happening to me? But provided you've accepted that, we can look at our situation. You can't change your height. When you can change your height. You can, but it's like no joke. First of all, you can't change it much. They maybe give you like an inch or two. You know how they do it? They break your legs, and then do these gnarly bone grafts, and then your legs reheal. Right? You're just like, oh, that's awful, right? Yeah, but imagine if you were 4'11", and then you might not be like, that's so awful. You probably would have Googled it. And so, you're 6 foot, so you're not like crying. You're like, oh, well, why would I do that to be 6'2"? You wouldn't, you idiot. It's for people who are 4'11", 4'6", or whatever, 4'3", 3'9". For them, a couple inches, it's like, that's no joke. And so, I don't know what the term is for that surgery, but it's like extremely gnarly. Stretch out. Your height's your height. Your ethnicity is your ethnicity. Your genetic code is your genetic code for this whole lifetime. Can't change it. There's epigenetics, how your genes express themselves, and there are things you can do in that regard. But a lot of it's determined. Melanin levels in your skin, all sorts of stuff. Going bald, all sorts of stuff. Color your eyes. Can do nothing whatsoever about it. Depression, 50% caused by genetics. Especially the most severe forms of depression. Wrap your head around that one. All sorts of stuff. We live in a world where we don't have near as much free will as we think we do. The Gunas are part of that worldview. And so Prakriti evolves as the Gunas. And the Gunas, there's three of them. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, which we'll discuss through this chapter. But what's happened is Krishna has brought the Gunas up, assumed you knew what they meant, but he finally has to get around to giving you his full take on it. He could have done it a different way. If he was Socrates, he would have done it a little differently. He would have introduced the Gunas at the beginning and dedicated the chapter to them at the beginning and then, only then, talk. But nobody wants to do that because it's so painful. Nobody gets involved in your book. If you define all of your terms from the get-go, people need a little bit of intrigue to get them going. So you kind of get them down, get them to sign up, and then you clean up some of the stuff on the back end. So Krishna finally made mention of the Gunas in a really massive way. Last chapter, it wasn't explained, and you're left kind of wondering, well, how exactly do I get in this body? How exactly is it all going on? How exactly does the soul become enraptured in this world? And so because Krishna introduced the term for that mechanism, he's now going to dedicate a whole chapter to explaining it. Did you guys follow that? All right, let's get into the chapter a little bit. Here we go. Again, I shall declare to you this supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, knowing which all the sages have attained the supreme destination. Parambuya pravakshami. I am speaking the greatest thing further. Again. Like you might say again to mean further, or you might say it to mean I'm actually saying the same thing again. I think in this regard, I'm going to speak further on the topic because he's going to say stuff he hasn't said before. Jnanam jnanam uttamam. See that? There's a little play on Sanskrit. Jnanam jnanam uttamam. The supreme knowledge amongst knowledges. The knowledge of knowledges is literally what Krishna says. But see how it flows so nicely? And of course, this is all written in, 8 syllables to a line. 4 lines, 4 quatrains, 8 syllables of quatrains. So Krishna's actually following rules, almost like what you might consider like, rhyming couplets or something like that. He's doing the Sanskrit version of that. Yaj gyatva munaya sarve. All the munis, having known this, param siddhim itagataha. After leaving this world, they attain the supreme perfection. So there's something formulaic going on there. Krishna is trying to get your attention in this very chapter. And in Vedic texts, one of the things you do right from the get-go is you tell people what they're going to get, and therefore they know why they should learn something. You glorify the thing you're going to learn. That's the jnanam jnanam uttamam. It's the knowledge of knowledges, the greatest knowledge of knowledges. And then there's this, and they go to the param siddhim. Itogataha. They go to the supreme abode after leaving this world, after having known this. So now you're like, okay, I want to know this. Idam jnanam upashrit. By becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain the transcendental nature, attain to the transcendental nature like my own. Thus established, one's not born at the time of creation, or disturbed at the time of dissolution. Idam jnanam upashritya. Taking shelter, having taken shelter of this knowledge. That's kind of a radical idea, right? That knowledge is something you take shelter of. That's not just something said in Sanskrit. It's an idea of the Indic people. That knowledge was this powerful thing you could take shelter of. Know the truth, for it shall set you free. Right? We have statements like this. Right? That's in the Bible. That's engraved on the walls of the CIA building, and a bunch of universities, Georgetown, a bunch of other universities. And so this idea that the truth was salvific. So you take shelter of knowledge. It's this thing that you can be sheltered by that will help you in times of need. Mama sadharmam sadharmyam agataha. And you'll attain a nature like my own. A dharma like mine. My dharma. You'll attain my dharma. Mama dharmyam. You'll attain to my dharma. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? What does that mean? Will we have the duty of God? Will we create the universe? No, probably not. Be in the hearts of all living entities? Probably not. So that's part of Krishna's dharma. We're not going to do that. What does it mean? Krishna says give up all dharmas, but now he's saying you'll attain a dharma like my own. You see how the word dharma, and it's just, there's no like big purport to that. It's just like, that's what it is. So we could say you'll achieve an eternal form like mine. You'll go back to heaven, and you'll have a body made out of spirit. Right? That works, right? Because he's talking about going to the supreme abode, and you'll attain a dharma like mine. You'll attain and then this idea that you'll have a form made out of eternality, bliss, and knowledge, like God's form. That works. Could also mean, if you take shelter as knowledge, you'll see the world like I see the world. You'll be able to see the world or you'll be able to come to a spiritual state of existence, transcend this world, by taking shelter of this knowledge, which is the greatest of all knowledge, which has the power to liberate you. Know the truth first will set you free. And that will enable you to have a spiritual understanding of reality that is similar to mine. That works, right? How about you'll live in this world but not be of it? Can Krishna be in this world but not be of it? Yes. Can we be in this world but not be of it? Yes. That's another way in which our dharma can become like Krishna's. So this word, I think all three of those things work real well. You'll go back to heaven and have a heavenly body, a little cherubim playing a harp. Or that you'll have a level of realization where you can see the big picture. Or that you'll be able to be in this world but not become attached. And those last two ideas are, of course, closely related. But I think they're discrete. So when you read a verse like this, how would you translate that into English? Prabhupada has to make a choice. One can attain to the transcendental nature like my own. Right? You follow? That works too. Dharma is now nature. Right? That works. One acquires qualitative equality with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. See, that's another translation of the word mama sadharmyam agata. See that? You acquire qualitative equality with the Supreme. The devotees do not lose their individual identities. See, it probably has to troubleshoot that. See that? So this is like you get this term and it requires a whole purport to explain. And so Prabhupada's, attempting to describe the ideas that naturally come to one's mind when they read this in the original language. Does that make sense? Along with some of the potential pitfalls that could be there. Now, Krishna says more. Sarge api na upajayante. They are not born again at the time of creation. Pralaye na vyatanticha. And they don't shake in the destruction. They're not disturbed, Prabhupada says, at the time of dissolution. So, it's kind of an interesting idea. It's like, you're not born again at the time of creation, and you're not disturbed at the time of dissolution. It doesn't exactly say you'll never take birth again, because the time of creation is this sort of like epic event that took place many millions of years ago, and the final destruction takes place, when the universe dies. So pralaya and sarga usually are used in those more macrocosmic terms. Now you could take them microcosmically and say you won't be born again when you die, like from a womb. And when you die, you won't be disturbed. You'll be able to be peaceful when you die. That would work if we microized If we took those big terms, they're usually used in big contexts in Sanskrit, universal creation, universal destruction, and we translate them in a more limited way, that would work. I like that. So what does he mean? You'll attain a nature like my own. You won't be born again. You won't die again. Therefore, you will attain to a spiritual abode and go back to heaven. The context of the second line helps you understand what was intended by the first word. Did you follow that? What was most probably intended by the first word? Are you guys following me here? Now do you guys see how the whole beginning of my class, when you're like, why isn't he talking about the verses, was all valuable? Because we can read these verses now and I can give a minimum amount of explanation and you guys can understand what I'm trying to say. Whereas if I just did this, I'd have to stop for the whole class at this verse. You get it? So you see the way the word dharma is used. It's multivalent. It's got multiple possible meanings. You got to choose which one to use. It's kind of used in a unique way here. But then the context of the rest of the verse, or literally the text, it's not even the context, the subsequent text tells you the most probable way to interpret it. And even that, to make it meaningful, you have to interpret it a little bit more in a unique way. That sarga now means your birth, and pralaya means your death, as opposed to the universe's birth and death, the way the term is normally used. Okay? We're just getting started, guys. We're just getting started. I gave my little thing on language and the limits of language, and the language also has an entire culture behind it, all on purpose. It wasn't accidental. I wasn't just going where I was moved. We're just going to get into it now. Here we go. The total material substance called Brahman is the source of birth, and it is that Brahman that I impregnate, making possible the births of all living beings. Now, what's wrong with that verse? The total material substance called Brahman is the source of birth, and it is that Brahman that I impregnate, making possible the births of all living beings. Yeah?
How could Brahman be totally material and make something that's a living being?
It just makes the body. It doesn't make the living being. Krishna injects the soul. No problem. Problem solved there. Come on, guys. Yeah.
Not that long ago, Krishna said Brahman is a spiritual substance. Now he's saying it's material.
Krishna just said in the last chapter that the gyayam, the most valuable thing you could devote your life to, is called Brahman. Brahman. And now here he's saying that Brahman is material. Is that a problem? That the same word is getting used for highest spiritual substance and full material substance? That's a pretty big problem. Let's look at the verse. Let's look at the verse. Mama yoni mahat brahma. My womb, the great Brahman. My womb, the great Brahman. Is there something in there that's not in the translation? Yes. Krishna makes himself sound like the male in the translation. It is that Brahman that I impregnate. But the actual verse says, my womb, great Brahman. Tasmin garbam dadam yaham. In that, I place the seed. So, who is Krishna? Is Krishna male or female? You have Krishna saying he is both. My womb, great Brahman, in that I place the seed. Okay, what does that mean, right? That's kind of a wild thing, right? Sambhava sarva bhutanam. Giving rise to all beings. Tato bhavati bharata. From that, all beings are given birth. From that act of God having sex with himself as both the masculine and feminine actor, Krishna makes possible the birth of all living entities. So obviously here we're talking about the universal creation. A sexual metaphor is being used, and Krishna, as God, is claiming both the masculine and feminine roles in the sexual act that gives rise to the world, that then gives rise to all living entities who then have their microbursts. You follow? Let's keep going. Don't worry, I'm not done. That's like, I want to get through one more verse, and then we're going to talk about it. Sarva yonishu kaunteya murtaya sambhavantiyaha. That same word sambhava is there. One is born into all wombs. So I thought it was Krishna's womb. Well, yeah, but Krishna's also aware that there are many wombs that you can be born from in different forms of life. So he's saying, in the universal sense, I've created the universe from my womb with my seed. I'm both Prakriti and Purusha. Did you follow that? I'm the source of both Prakriti and Purusha. I created the universe. Not ex nihilo. Christianity posits that God created the world ex nihilo, from nothing, from nil. That's why this world in Christian thought is fundamentally bad. It's mammon. It's the opposite of the divine. Here we have something which would be much more akin to paganism, where everything is divine, everything is part of the same substance. And so now Krishna, why are you looking vexed? You spaced out, right? Pay attention. This isn't the light part of class, guys. That was before. This is like the serious part of class. The light part of class when you can space out, that was never. It's definitely not now. Focus, everybody. Krishna's worldview is much more pagan, where everything is sacred, everything has some spirituality to it. In Krishna's monistic worldview, the material world is not a separate substance, but it's also him. Do you guys follow that? So there's the great womb and the great sex act that gives rise to the universe, and then there is the subsequent births and deaths people enjoy in this world that are the consequence of that initial act on the part of Krishna, who's both masculine and feminine. Krishna literally says, I'm the mother of the universe. Asya Jagata Mata. I'm the mother of the universe. Literally says, and he's the father. Pitaham. I'm the father and the mother of the universe. So you find the same thing being used here. Also, sex metaphors are like not super cool when it comes to divinity, because I think we've all inherited some kind of Victorian queasiness when it comes to sex. And so, obviously people are sexual beings, and so sex is a part of people's lives. But when you start talking about God and sex, and like that God is having sex with himself, it starts to sound hermaphroditic, and it starts to sound really weird, and it makes people super uncomfortable. Like, I watched The Room. When I say God is having sex with himself, everybody kind of was like, that's yuck. But that's like a real tame conservative, that's a real tame conservative read of the text. And Krishna just simply does not appear to have any problem using sexual metaphors, because he just dropped the granddaddy and grandma of all sexual metaphors on you, that he had sex with himself and created the universe. And he's both the womb as well as the penis. He's the phallus and the womb. You follow? And this is like a sacred text, like you'll chant the verse. Like you get a bunch of brahmanas, and they're like, Mama yone mahat brahma tasmin garbam dadam yaham sambhavasava bhutanam tato bhavati bharata. It's like a whole thing, right? They're all chanting together, right? I am the womb. I am the seed-giving father. One name for Krishna is Vishvareta, which means like the universal semen. Just these concepts were just not profane in in this culture. And so they're freely used. See how that whole thing I said about cultures and different, it's actually on purpose. The cool thing is I thought of it when I sat down. But that's the cool thing, is I thought of it when I sat down and opened the book up. But all that stuff I said before, I want you guys to then use to troubleshoot and make meaningful and stretch your minds out so you can appreciate the verse. Does that make sense? All right. Tasam Brahma Mahat Yonir Aham Bija Pradapita. And of all, I am the great womb and also the seed-giving Father. So there's the sexual metaphor being used again. You follow? So it's used twice in 2 verses. I'm the great womb and the seed-giving Father. Now, the womb that the seed is placed into, the body that the soul is placed into, matter that's impregnated with spirit, spirit which is interfacing with matter. You follow? You still have this dualism of the soul in the body. What Krishna has done is he's muddied it up. Because instead of thinking that the soul, the body is matter made from nothing, is material, you now have the idea that the body is also spiritual and coming from God. Did you guys follow that? And there's nothing which is truly separate from divinity. And everything comes from the same source. Did you guys wrap your head around that? That's a wild concept. You might think, oh yeah, I knew that, or oh yeah, but if you did know that, then you wouldn't get so freaked out by sex talk. You might get freaked out by exploitative sex talk. You might get freaked out by a wanton sex talk or lusty sex talk that pulled you away from divinity. But just the whole subject wouldn't freak you out. I mean, Krishna even says, Kamosmi, I am desire. And so, I mean, Krishna really, if you really want to get it, Krishna is Cupid. If Cupid was conceived of as being the source of all reality. That ultimately, the same way consciousness should be seen, that we live in a biocentric universe, with consciousness being the starting place of everything, because objective reality only exists when it's subjectively available. You only discern objective reality with your subjective consciousness. Similarly, we should also understand that love gives rise to the universe, and Krishna is the transcendental Cupid. Okay, so we're left with Sattvam, Rajas, Dhamma, Iti. Sattvam, Rajas, and Tamas. Guna, Prakriti, Sambhava. The gunas coming from Prakriti, produced from Prakriti, born of Prakriti. Nibadnanti Mahabaho. They bind Dehe Dehinam Avyayam. They bind the embodied in the body. Dehinam means the embodied in the body. It's another Sanskrit play. Dehinam Dehe, the embodied in the body. Nibadnanti, they bind. What binds you? The gunas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And where are they born from? Prakriti. And what's Prakriti? It's me. You follow? And so now the whole material world gets a little spiritual twist, because there's nothing which is truly evil. There is no fundamental evil. Nothing is truly divorced from God. And that's why when we offer things to Krishna, we consider that they become re-spiritualized. Like I just was doing the offering today. And we had some laddu, which is this weird sweet made out of chickpeas. Like, that's a thing in India. You make sweets out of chickpeas all the time. So we make sweets out of chickpea flour. It sounds totally funky. It's totally cool. Definitely worth doing. It's a cool thing. If you know, you know. There it is. So I washed the deity's plates. I was putting them away, but I noticed as I was just about to wash the plate that the laddu, this basin sweet, this chickpea flour sweet was in, it had just a little tiny bit of chickpea on it. And I was about to wash it down the drain. And I was like, nah, that's offensive, because that was offered on the altar, therefore that's sacred. So I had to like smear it out with my finger. And then I went and wiped it on the inside of the cup I was going to drink water from. You follow? I would never do this normally. Like, have a weird little bit of like random food sitting on my cup. But my understanding is that that food is sacred, and a little tiny bit of that would have been offensive for me to not consider it sacred. So I wiped on the inside of my cup, and then I ate it. I smeared my thing on it and ate it before I drank water later. Does that make sense? So that's just like the kind of weird OCD world I live in, where I believe that when you take material things and you offer them back to Krishna, they become spiritual. And that nothing in this world is truly material. And that everything can be spiritualized. And that nothing's truly profane. It's just when you use a good thing in a wrong way, it becomes bad. Do you follow this? So, Krishna has now introduced the Gunas. But as a precursor to introducing the Gunas, he explained a really important point, which is that he's the source of everything which exists. He's also the source of matter. That's a radical concept. And it's important to not go down the radical dualism road, especially when you start to introduce concepts like the Gunas that tend to make you want to go down the dualism road, which is familiar to you, where there's good and evil, and there's right and wrong, and there's good and bad, and there's victims and aggressors and stuff like that. And so this little chunk of philosophy at the beginning helps protect us as we go down the road of the Gunas, which starts sounding like we're victimized by this evil force which is tearing us down, this and that and the other thing. And we get to remember that everything comes from Krishna, including the Gunas. Like, I'm sure a name for Krishna is Guneshwar. I've never heard it. I don't find it a particularly attractive name. Like, if someone's like, your name is Guneshwar, that's to be like, that's a little rough. You know? But like Maheshwar, you know, it's like, all right, Gurudev, thank you. but I'm sure it's a name of Krishna, Guneshwar. All right, thank you guys very much for watching on IGTV. Adios, amigos. And you can hang on Facebook for a quick second if you want.